YouTube, what is good? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about the lens that is on the new Rollei 35AF camera. This is an autofocus camera, and that's the lens for the camera. Just some quick specs to talk about here. It's a 35mm lens, and the maximum aperture is f2.8. So this is pretty standard when you think about 35mm lenses for really small cameras. You can compare this to what you would find on really small film cameras that are typically rangefinders or scale focusing cameras. Olympus XA cameras, for example. Obviously, the old school Rolleis that this is built off of, and then also some of the rangefinder lenses that you would find on like old Leicas or old Canon rangefinder cameras. The lenses all tended to be pretty small, and they all tended to have kind of the similar focal length and also aperture. So this is right in there in terms of kind of what you expect to see from a specs perspective on this lens. This lens is a glass lens, so there's no plastic involved here to make this lens cheaper or lighter or smaller or anything like that. It is a 5-element glass lens according to the specs. A lot of people have been asking in comments and other videos, is this lens also modeled after the old school Rollei camera? And I have not gotten any confirmation on that, so I can't say that they replicated the design or anything like that. People who have used the old cameras or who own them now, comment down below if after looking at these images you think there's a comparison here to be made. But yeah, this is a glass lens, so it's definitely something that we want when we're shooting film. And the lens is basically what you would expect in terms of capabilities compared to typical very small film camera lenses for 35mm full frame. One thing to note is that right now this lens, it does not have any threads. There's a little bit of grip on it on the side here, which I'm not actually sure what that's for since you don't move this back and forth. But my assumption is that that grip there could be used for a 3D printed adapter. So if you do want to put filters on this lens, screw-on filters, perhaps you can 3D print an adapter that goes on top of this, and then that adapter has a thread on it that you can screw something onto. Because other than that, I don't see how else you would put a filter on here, other than Rollei releasing their own set of filters, which I've got no indication on as well. So we'll see how that goes. But I know filters are very important for a lot of people, especially ND filters, especially with a camera like this where the maximum shutter speed is 1/500th of a second. Cutting down the light is important because if you're shooting fully automatic, you're going to want to control the amount of light that goes here on a very, very bright sunny day if you want to shoot wide open. If you don't care about shooting wide open and you'd rather stop down, then maybe that's not going to be an issue. But if you want to shoot wide open as much as possible on a sunny day, it might get very tough, especially if you have higher ISO film like ISO 400 or above. The camera is going to overexpose. So just something to keep in mind, that the lack of thread here might actually be an issue if you really want to shoot at f2.8 all the time, no matter what. All right, let's look at some test images here. All right, so for this image test, I really wanted to see how this lens can do up close at the minimum focusing distance and shot at various apertures. You will see some slight variation here in the exposures, and I shot fully automatic, so the camera kind of did whatever it wants. So that's how you would account for that. There's also a little bit of haze on Naeem's face here, and I believe that's a lens flare, given that he was slightly backlit. I'm honestly surprised, though, that there was some flaring there. But I wasn't testing for that specifically, so I can't give you an educated opinion on that just yet. So kind of try to disregard it. We're looking here at sharpness and bokeh and that kind of thing. So looking at these 6 shots here, the first shot, which is this one, was shot wide open at 2.8. And like I said, I got as close as possible to Naeem. So I kept pressing the focusing button until it would not allow me to actually focus. And then I knew that I was somewhere in the vicinity. And then I pulled back and then got an in-focus shot. So this is at the minimum focusing distance of the camera. And as you can see here at f2.8, at this distance, you're going to get the maximum bokeh in your image. And that's what you see around Naeem here. It's very pleasing. It doesn't have any kind of aggressive kind of vintage character, which, this is a modern lens. It was made for this camera. So you wouldn't expect some of that. But you can typically see anything interesting in this kind of bokeh here if there was some vintage character. It looks pretty flat, pretty normal. So yeah, that's what you would expect. So this is at 2.8. Let's zoom in before I show you a comparison so you can see what the sharpness looks like. This performs all right at 2.8. You can see some of the detail there on the Ray-Ban, although if you didn't know that was the word Ray-Ban, then maybe you wouldn't be able to read it. But you know, there's a lot of texture here in his face with his beard and stuff like that. And you can make out some of those things, but a lot of it does look slightly mushy. And this is shot wide open, so it's kind of what you should expect. And then looking at his necklace here, the dog tags, you can see the little individual circles. So this is pretty sharp. You can see all the detail that you need to see, but as you'll see in the comparison, there's still a lot more room here to go in terms of actual sharpness. So let's set a comparison here. We'll compare the F2 to the F4. Let's turn on the information. So F2 is on the left here and F4. So we're going to zoom in, and immediately you already start to see some improvement here. In his cheek right here, you can't really see much of the texture, and here you start to see a lot more of it. So let's move on to let's move on to come on. Okay, this is F5.6 here, and you already can see significantly more sharpness in basically everything. Especially up here in the Ray-Ban, you're starting to see a lot more. Here, let me move that down. In the Ray-Ban, you're starting to see a lot more definition in the letters. And then, like I mentioned, the texture. There's a bit more texture now on his lips, that kind of thing. Let's move on to F8. I think this is where the lenses really sharpen up, like, to their maximum. So now you can really see the difference here in the Ray-Ban. And let me get out of here and then put this at 200. That way you can really see. Okay, so the Ray-Ban here and the Ray-Ban there. This is F28 on the left, and on the right, this is F8. So you can really see the difference here. This is super mushy. You can't make out anything. And then here, you can actually see the individual letters to some degree. And this is 200% zoom, so this is really pushing it. But, you know, I think this is where you really see the difference. And then let's zoom into the necklace. Here you can also see the big difference. So, you know, this looks sharp. The F28 looks sharp when I showed it to you by itself. But now when you compare it to F8, you really see the difference. So this is normal, by the way. This happens with every lens. The sharpest point on the lens is usually 2 stops or so from the widest aperture. So on a lens like this, F28, the sharpest point is going to be somewhere at F5.6 or F8, which is exactly where we are right now. So this is to be expected, but I think it's important for you to see what you're going to get, especially wide open, because a lot of lenses sometimes are unusable when they're wide open, and unusable is completely subjective. That's your call to make. But when you zoom out here, just looking at the images, this looks perfectly usable. I think this looks good. I think there is plenty of detail there, especially when you're not pixel peeping like I have been right now. Just for the purpose of illustration, let's move on to F11. And let's zoom in again, and you should just see more of what we already discussed. Actually, here, this is looking different here, and this is because in this lighting scenario that I was in, F11 was actually too slow for the shutter speed. So the automatic settings at F11 made the shutter speed go slow, and I was probably shooting this with one hand. And as you can see, we get some motion blur. So something to note about using this automatic camera is that you can't see what settings are actually going to be activated when you're shooting an automatic. Obviously, you know the aperture because you have to select the aperture, but shutter speed wise, you don't know what your shutter speed is going to be. After you take the shot, you obviously will hear the shutter speed, so maybe that'll give you an indication as to how fast or slow it was, but you never actually know the shutter speed. And I think this is one of the challenges with this camera. We'll talk about that in the full review in a week or two. But just know that when you're shooting fully automatic, the camera's doing whatever it wants, and you have no idea what the settings were other than the aperture. So you might get a situation like this where there's actually not enough light for a sharp kind of fast image, but you know, you don't know that because of the fact that you don't know the settings. And you'll see here again at f16, same thing, more motion blur here because of the fact that it was not enough light for a faster shutter speed. So yeah, if we compare these two, you can see that there's significantly less bokeh now in the background, and that makes total sense because we're shooting at f16, so you're getting a lot more depth of field. And everything theoretically would clean up and be way sharper, but again, that's if I had a fast enough shutter speed here. I was handheld, so a slow shutter speed is not going to help me. But let's just look at this image by itself now. This is, you know, let's full screen it. This is f2.8, wide open on the lens, as close as you can get. And I think this is pretty pleasing. For someone like me who shoots a lot of portraits, this isn't enough in terms of how close I can get to my subject, unfortunately. But you do get a nice pleasing image with this. You can make a great image with this camera if you wanted to. All right, let's look at one more example here. Actually, I got two more examples, but we'll do this kind of quickly because they're pretty similar. So this image right here was shot at f8, and I'm going to compare it to an f2 image. So again, f8 is on the left now, and on the right is the f2. So let's just zoom right in. This is what you would expect. At f8, you get a lot more texture in the water, more sharpness. You get to see a lot more of the contrast in the image, whereas at f2.8, it's all looking a bit more mushy, you would say, all more uniform. And it's especially evident here when you look at the trees. These trees are a bit sharper, a bit more in focus compared to these. And you're getting a little bit of blooming here as well because of the fact that it's not sharp. So to be expected, but it's for you to decide, is the image sharp enough for your taste at 2.8? And obviously you don't always have to shoot at 2.8. That doesn't really make sense for all kinds of scenarios, especially if it's super bright out. So this is just an illustration. You don't have to shoot at 2.8. You can pick whatever shutter speed you want. Sorry, you can pick whatever aperture you want. But again, just to kind of illustrate the point to you. All right, so let's look at another example here. This one, you're going to see a lot more of what we already discussed, but one thing to note here is, again, with the automatic settings on the camera, if you're shooting too wide open, your potential for overexposure goes up because of the fact that the lighting situation where you're at might be too bright. So here, this is midday sun outside, and obviously you can see it's very bright. So I was forcing the camera to shoot at f2.8 in the image on the left and f4 on the right, and both of those were too wide open on the lens for the lighting condition at the automatic settings, which is 1/500th of a second, I would have assumed. So as you can see, shooting at wide open is not always ideal and not always necessary. And if you force the camera to do it, you're probably going to overexpose depending on how bright it is outside. So just quickly zooming in here, you can see at f2.8, this looks very soft. There's a little bit of blooming here, maybe some motion, not motion blur, what am I saying? Just a little bit of blooming. It's very not sharp. Compared to this one here, you start to see a lot more detail already. You lose some of that like blooming effect. Moving on to f5.6 on the right now, it just kind of amplifies what we already saw. So you're getting a lot more contrast in the background and a lot more sharpness on the net. And of course, as I move to f5.6, you're starting to get closer to a proper exposure now that you're at 5.6 as opposed to 2.8. So you're really controlling for that extra light. And as you can see here, the exposures look different. This is very bright. This is less bright. Moving on to f8, I think this here is now is a proper exposure. This is what you would get, a baseline exposure. Nothing is blown out. Zooming in, you can really see the difference here now. You can see more sharpness in the actual rim here, in the net, in the bricks, in the sign. Although you can probably attribute this one to kind of overexposure. It's a white sign and therefore it's going to be blown out. But you can read, what it says a little bit here. Although now that I say that, I can't really read it, but the letters can be perceived a bit better than you can in this sign. We are pixel peeping, obviously, but just to illustrate the point. And then finally, f11, same thing, just slightly more sharpness. You can notice a bit more of the grain now. It's less mush. You see a lot more of the individual detail. So just something to consider, again, if you're going to be shooting this camera, that you do get much better results sharpness-wise when you stop down the lens. And that's not anything new to this camera. This is basically with all lenses. The question is, at the f2.8, are you okay with the amount of perceived sharpness in those images? Because it really is about perception. Obviously, one stop will give you fundamentally more sharpness than the other, but does that matter? Does that actually change your image in any way? Does it make it better or worse? That's your call. For someone like me who shoots a lot of portraits, I often do want more bokeh just because it's more pleasing, and therefore I do tend to shoot more wide open because I want to separate the subject from the background. But there are situations where I want the background to be factored into the shot, and of course I'll stop down in order to get a bit more sharpness in the background and a bit more clarity there as well. So these are choices, but I think it was important for you to see how this lens could perform. So yeah, that's it. That's our lens test. Very unscientific, but I still think it was useful. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments what you think about the lens test. A lot more images to come when I put out my final review, but I wanted to give you just a peek at very specific images here, looking exactly at how this lens performs. All right, y'all, to the next one. I'm out.